Welcome to Conversations on Modern Slavery. My name is Brian Lippincott. I'm the Director of Communications at Free the Slaves and co-host this podcast with my colleague, Dr. Marta Furlan, the Senior Program Manager for Research. Conversations on Modern Slavery takes you inside the global fight to end modern slavery. Each episode features engaging conversations with researchers, survivor leaders, frontline advocates, and policy experts, diving into the root causes, current challenges, and bold solutions driving change. Whether you're new to the issue or deeply involved in the work, this podcast offers fresh insights and powerful stories to inform, inspire, and mobilize. Climate change is reshaping our world in ways that we are only beginning to fully understand. Rising seas, stronger storms, and disappearing harvests. But there is one consequence that rarely makes it into the climate change conversation: the way environmental disruption can push people into situations of exploitation, trafficking, and abuse. Today, we are exploring that connection, and we are doing it through the lens of a place that sits on the front lines of climate change, Antigua and Barbuda. To guide us through this conversation, I am joined by three guests: Dr. Marta Furlan, Dr. Bethany Jackson, and Ms. Marver Woodley. Ms. Marver Woodley is the Senior Operations and Policy Manager in the Department of Blue Economy under the Ministry of Agriculture, Lands, Fisheries, and the Blue Economy, leading work on ocean policy, sustainability, and strategic project development. Her passion for climate change has also led to her being the Pan-Commonwealth Coordinator of the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network. She serves as Public Relations Officer of the Sora Optimist International Antigua and Caribbean Women in Leadership Antigua Chapter. Dr. Bethany Jackson is a Nottingham Research Fellow in the School of Geography and the Rights Lab Lead in Decent Work and Climate Change Risks, both at the University of Nottingham. A geographer by training, Bethany's work is focused on the impact of climate change on access to decent working conditions. She has shared her work with the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Public and Development Office and the US Trafficking in Persons Office, and has been cited by the Office of the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and the EAT Lancet Commission. Dr. Marta Furlan is the Senior Program Manager for Research at Free the Slaves. She is also a Research Fellow on Climate Change and Conflict at Accept and a non-resident Research Fellow at the Center on Armed Groups. Marta holds a PhD in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews, where her research focused on armed non-state actors and civil conflict dynamics. Her research interests include the human rights impact of climate change, with a special focus on Indigenous communities. She is passionate about community-based participatory action research that involves people in the formulation of solutions. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here for what I think is a genuinely important and underreported conversation.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So glad that you're all here. So let's start at the beginning. I'd like to start with a question for Marta and Marver. When most people hear Antigua and Barbuda, they picture beaches, sailing, and paradise. But can you help us understand what the economy actually looks like for people who live and work there, and why this particular island nation is so exposed to climate change?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That's an excellent question to start with to help us set the stage. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Antigua and Barbuda is what is known as a small island developing state, or SIDS, which is a category of states that are characterized by certain features, such as remoteness, like they're generally dispersed throughout the world's oceans and seas, with some of them being in very remote areas far away from the nearest landmass. They're also characterized by small populations, which also limits the options that these nation states have for building diversified economies and taking advantage of scale. Another characteristic that seeds such as Antigua and Barbuda share is the dependence on ocean resources, to the point that some seeds refer to themselves as large ocean states. And if we think of like some of these countries, their economies are deeply dependent on the surrounding ecosystem. Tourism and fisheries can constitute up to half of the GDP in some of these small island economies. And another characteristics of these scenes is the reliance on imports, meaning that they cannot produce because of their small land areas. They can't produce everything that they need, and they rely on imports for food, water, and energy. So now, what makes these kind of states, small island developing states, quite exposed to climate change and impacts are, on the one hand, this geographic exposure, which means that because seeds display low-lying coastal areas, isolation, and location in high-risk tropical zones, they are prone to sea level rise, intense tropical storms, hurricane, and severe ocean changes. But on the other hand, economic dependency on climate-sensitive sectors, which means that in context of climate change or related events, their economies suffer profoundly. And before passing it on to Marver, who perhaps would want to add something more specific to Antigua and Barbuda, where she lives and works, I just want to add that supporting seeds to strengthen their resilience to climate change is a matter of climate justice, considering that these nation states account for only 1% of global emissions. So they hold the least responsibility for the climate crisis, and yet they are at the front line of climate change and its impacts.
Yeah, and thank you, Martha, for setting that beautiful backdrop, and once again, thank you, Brian, for not just inviting me, but allowing small island states to have a local representative on a platform such as this, and in kind of even painting the bigger picture for what Matt would have just set the scene for, with regards through the lens of a small island states like mine, Antigua and Barbuda, the realities are even a bit more beautiful or elaborately painted than just that, because while we do have characteristics of being a small and developing state, it goes a little bit just past our geographical location. A lot of our dependency, especially our GDP and our economy, is heavily based on tourism. So some of those features, those natural features that Matt would have mentioned, are some of our touristic attractions, and is what also helps many families support themselves. So in times and when there are different climate change elements that are exacerbated, and as Martha beautifully said, we are on the front lines of it despite providing or contributing very little to the actual realities of what's happening, because we not just only have extreme weather conditions, we are now also seeing rising sea levels, which trickle down to rising temperatures, ocean acidification. So our fish stocks, which we heavily depend on to feed our people, is being altered, it's being triggered. We're having longer and hotter summers. I remember when we just started our conversation, I said, hey, it's pretty warm, it's beautiful, it's sunny, but it's very warm. And those type of elements persons are having to adapt. And when we say persons are adapting, because oftentimes in the conversations of climate change, we say you are adapting or you're trying to mitigate the effects. And it's hard when you ask persons in vulnerable communities or vulnerable circumstances, which we do have persons in our community and on our island living in and with. How do they adapt when they are not just now placed on this small rock? So Antigua and Barbuda, for a little bit more of even location and geographical context, is 108 square miles, and our population is just under 100,000. In some places, that's just what maybe a village, a community, and but those are persons who are living and working in the realities of a small island and with climate change. So having understand that a lot of our reliance for how we feed our people, our culture, our history is so heavily based on the actual island and where we're positioned and our neighbors, because that's very important, because a feature of small island developing states is that we tend to do a lot of negotiation on international platforms as a bloc. We go as a bloc because we understand that our size and limitation and access to resources and human capital resource is also a very strong feature of a small and developing states, much like Antigua and Barbuda, that in climate change, human exploitation, and all of those conversations, we have to keep those at the forefront of our conversation and be cognizant of those nuances. So that's a little bit about Antigua and Barbuda. Uh, we do face climate change. We are on the forefront of trying to mitigate one of our biggest climate change nuance, especially when we come on to the summer and these warmer months, is the influx of sargassum. What happens to those fisher folks community on the coastlines who are going to be affected by that huge influx of sargassum? So those are a little bit of our realities, a little bit of our challenges, but still, as a small island state, we press on and we try our best to heavily rely and diversify our economy and our basket of goods.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marta and Marver, for that overview of kind of the situation of small island developing states, and then also the specific context of Antigua and Barbuda. So Marta, to continue on and dive into the research a little bit deeper, Marta, your team conducted in-depth research on Antigua and Barbuda, interviews with government officials, civil society representatives, academics, and regional experts. What did you find? How is climate change actually affecting people's lives there?
Yes, thank you, Brian. And last February, so Free the Slaves and the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative (CHRI) published this report that is now available on Free the Slaves website on the intersection between climate change and vulnerability to human exploitation in small island developing states, using Antigua and Barbuda as a case study. And what our research identified is that there are kind of 6 interconnected climate-induced vulnerabilities that reinforce each other. So they don't operate in isolation, but they create what we might call a cycle of vulnerability. And I will discuss them a bit more in depth. So one of these vulnerabilities or pathways towards vulnerabilities actually is the loss of livelihood. So if you think about what happens when a hurricane hits, is that hotels and other tourist infrastructure are damaged. Tourists will cancel their plan to visiting the islands. Fishing boats, fishing and farms may get damaged or destroyed. And recovery then takes months or even years, depending on the severity of the event. And this is affecting livelihoods in a negative way. People are no longer able to rely on the income that they would have previously been able to make. And women in particular tend to find themselves without an income for longer because they have fewer alternative employment options to fall back on when compared to male counterparts. Another issue that we found is the health impacts connected to climate change and climate change related events. And here we have the direct impacts, heat stress, injuries from storms or hurricanes. Indirect impacts, salt water getting into the freshwater systems, causing waterborne diseases, reducing access to safe drinking water. And now we also have more diffuse health impacts. For instance, the deteriorating mental health that comes from living through repeated disasters, rebuilding, and then doing it all over again. So that psychological toll is not as visible, but is very real. Another pathway that we found from climate change to vulnerability is connected to housing. So extreme weather causes widespread residential damage and displacement, and it's not just about the immediate destruction. We also have to consider rising insurance costs and construction expenses that mean that many families simply cannot afford to rebuild their houses in safety. And adding to that the long-term pressure of sea level rise that is gradually pushing coastal communities more inland, this is creating a housing crisis that keeps deepening. Fourthly, another pathway that we identified in the research is human mobility. Around 3,366 people in Antigua are at risk of displacement every single year from a sudden onset hazard. And when people are forced to move, and this can be whether either inside the nation state, as I said before, towards the inland parts of the country or across borders, they lose their regular livelihoods. People lose their social networks, their community structures that normally protect them and constitute the safety network. Fifthly, we have to consider education. So when there are climate change related events, especially if we think of the most dramatic ones such as hurricanes, schools get damaged, they can be repurposed as emergency shelters, or it also can become too hot to learn effectively in the schools. Many of these schools don't have a AC system that makes the classrooms cool enough for students and teachers to be able to function in the day-to-day learning experience. Also, children from displaced families that are forced to change schools, move from one school to the other, may fall behind in their studies. It can take time to accommodate these new students in the new classroom. And the longer the children are out of school, the more vulnerable they become. And finally, another important pathway that we identified, again, from climate change to vulnerability is connected to food and water insecurity. So Antigua and Barbuda is one of the most water-stressed countries in the Caribbean, and droughts and saltwater intrusion reduce what can be grown and what can be safely drunk. So we are observing a deepening situation in which people are no longer able, in those conditions of climate change extreme events, to access food and water with the stability that is required. And as I said, these are not operating in isolation, but these 6 pathways that our research identifies are very much interconnected. They reinforce, they exacerbate each other, and they create this cycle of vulnerabilities that is especially affecting certain families and certain groups, as I hope that we will be able to see in our conversation with the input of Marver later on. And I think I will pass it now on to Beth, who has done terrific work on the intersection of climate change and vulnerability to trafficking, and I'm sure that she has a lot to say from her own research.
Thanks, Marta. Yeah, I think in terms of the research that we've done, we did a study that we published a report in 2023 that was focused on the impacts of sudden onset hazards on human trafficking and migration in the Sundarbans region of Bangladesh and India. That was in partnership with ORCUP, Caritas India, Bangladesh, and CAFOD. And we did see some similar responses into the work that you've done in Antigua, reflecting on those vulnerabilities. And whilst we acknowledge that the responses need to be unique and tailored to the specific needs of communities that are being affected, and that varies across geographies, cultures, and the resources that are available, those similarities are present. So in our research, we identified that loss of livelihoods, particularly from cyclones, had seen communities have a loss of livelihoods, predominantly traditional subsistence farming and aquaculture and fishing within the Sundarbans region. And there'd been more of a shift towards seasonal migration, towards larger urban settlements in order to diversify livelihoods. And that was directly used as a way of helping to rebuild and adapt to both future climate events, whether that be buying different kinds of seeds, investing in barriers and flooding mitigation, or whether that be being able to change the way that your housing can respond to potential storm surges, for example. And what we did see is, as Marta mentioned, around women being particularly more at risk, is that those are the household members who are usually left behind when someone migrates to diversify that livelihood in order to adapt to climate change. And that not only led to the potential increased risk of remaining exposed to climate hazards whilst remaining in within the household, but also that burden of taking on additional household roles on top of their normal working patterns. So where they might normally care for family members, they were now also having to care for family members and take on the subsistence roles. And what was really clear is that that repeated exposure to hazard events really affected the capacity and the choices that were being made by household members, particularly within Bangladesh. So the impact of Cyclone Ayla that happened in 2009 was still being referred to by households as having a significant economic and social impact that's had this lasting effect almost 15 years later. So that complexity of the drivers, particularly affecting lower income, more rural and isolated communities, is something that I think reflects some of the issues that we're seeing in a small island state like Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you so much, Marta and Beth, for sharing that. Um, so my next question is I want to turn back to Marver. Um, so in what you described earlier, you described kind of the set of vulnerabilities that affect the whole country. But I wanted to ask, are all communities and all people equally exposed to those risks? Or are there some populations within the country that carry a heavier burden?
And most definitely you do see definite some pockets of society and within our communities being affected some more than others. And even within this report it was highlighted more so, and they kind of even gave it a better breakdown, because we do have some research that is done on Ireland, but seeing it through these lenses are very important, because once again, when we speak about climate vulnerabilities and human vulnerabilities, they are kind of inseparable. They kind of go hand in hand, and they overlap. They kind of even triple the effects when it comes to small island state. And in the report, I want to highlight that it touched on women and girls, especially when we see climate impacts on small island states like ours. Women are often they're in lower paying, maybe informal and climate resilient sectors, once again, like tourism or hospitality, or doing some type of domestic or small scale work, whether it's even in the industries like fisheries or constructions. So we see that they're heavily affected when it comes to climate impacts. We also see climate disasters frequently affecting women when it comes to child or caregiving within society, because they automatically assume these duties sometimes not being paid, sometimes also not being properly taken care of because of the conditions at the time. We also see certain economic pressures. So for most persons, when climate shocks or climate effects happen, we see labor is being exploited, especially with women and girls. We see transactional relationships, and even some gender-based violence. So understanding those different impacts, and we can even break it down further to single women, and that's just with women as a subsection of society, because single women and single mothers are particularly vulnerable due to not having sufficient climate buffers, or whether it's resources to adequately support themselves during these times. We also see youth as a subsection when it comes to either maybe unemployment. It's exacerbated during these climate shocks. We have also limited economic opportunities and maybe prospects that may push young persons into unsafe working conditions again, or exploitative conditions. We also have migrant workers are a pocket, because Antigua and Barbuda is at this beautiful position within the Eastern Caribbean, where it is known as the hub for other Eastern Caribbean islands, such as our neighbors like St. Kitts, Montserrat, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, and the likes. So we oftentimes see when there is a natural disaster in one of our neighboring islands, persons migrate to Antigua and set up homes. And then we also see when there are different adverse climate realities in Antigua, like what would have happened in Hurricane Irma in Barbuda, we see persons moving over to Antigua and likes. So we also see that there's a heavy reliance on migrant labor. Also when it comes to the hospitality sector again, construction, or maybe even domestic services. And there's language barriers. There's huge populations in our community who are Spanish speakers. There is some limited legal protections, because oftentimes as a small island state, we don't have all of the adequate legal protections, whether it's policy or human resources within the police forces. And we can even go further down to like look at coastal communities, because again, as an island, you have some persons who live so close with so close along the coast and tongue twister, so close along the coast that they are impacted heavier than others. Again, that sargassum influx that's going to come up, is the scent is going to bother some communities, it's going to stifle some fishermen from going out. So we see those things happening, and even we can even take it further back to look at when there was a hurricane eruption in St. Vincent a few years back. A lot of the soot and the ash, it came right over to Antigua. So we're also seeing that those things do play a part because of our proximity to each other, and it does affect coastal communities. Persons with disabilities, we would have mentioned that in my earlier statement, and they're not to be forgotten because persons are often excluded from disaster plans. They're often excluded from evacuation or employment or even post-disaster assistance when these things happen. And oftentimes we find them disproportionately dependent on others. And in a vulnerable situation, persons may not be as inclined to take care of a disabled person, granted they are maybe looking up for themselves, and it's a reality that we have to understand within our society. And then there are also other form of workers, other sectors. We have street vendors, we have different persons in different pockets. So when we look at even the report overall, I would say the detailed findings was very important because it showed the different impacts across all of our populations and all of the subsectors that could be heavily exacerbated.
Thank you so much, Marver, for that detailed breakdown of how the various communities are differently affected by climate events and the related vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are very serious in their own right. But then, Marta, the research, goes further and draws a connection between those vulnerabilities and human exploitation. Can you explain a little bit more about how those linkages are formed, and what you found in the research?
Yeah, so up until now we were discussing how climate change and climate change related events create pathways to vulnerability. And the next step, the following step that our research dived into, is to understand how those vulnerabilities then translate into situations of exploitation. And what we found is that in the case of women and girls, what happens is that when hurricanes, for instance, or other climate change related events erode income generating activities, make them no longer available, some women that find themselves with no better options, and this is especially women that are either working in the informal sector or in the tourism sector that we said before, and Marver emphasized is one of those that has one of those that are most exposed to the impacts of climate change. These women will then transition towards looking for employment opportunities in local bars. And here, duties can quietly extend to providing sexual services for clients who are willing to pay. And what starts as a survival strategy can then slide into systematic sexual exploitation, which is oftentimes controlled by bar owners or intermediaries who set the conditions and make the profit. What we also found is that women, beyond finding work in local bars, may also find themselves working in other informal sectors, and here they may ending up into situations of labor exploitation. Perhaps they find themselves entering the job without signing a contract. They are working without sick leave, without holidays, and they have no power to push back because they feel that they have no other opportunities. So even if avenues to for advocating for their own rights are available in a country such as Antigua and Barbuda, women in that situation would feel discouraged pursuing those avenues because they feel that even if they're exploited in those informal sector, there is no other income generating opportunity. And especially if we are talking about single mothers, a category of people that Marver spoke about before, they are in a situation of extreme vulnerability. They have children to take care of, so they would go for whatever income generating activity is available, even if exploitative. Also, another important pattern that the research found is that under situations of climate stress, domestic violence has been increasing. In Caribbean societies, men are often expected to be the provider of the family, of the household. And when climate change takes away that role because men lose their job, they're no longer capable of making an income that can support their family, feelings of failure and frustration can swoop in, and they can manifest in harmful behavior like increased alcohol abuse, verbal abuse, and physical violence towards their partners. And finally, for men and boys, the research found that exploitation for them often looks like informal manual labor taken out of desperation, with employers who may systematically be delaying or withholding their wages. Also, some younger men can also end up in situation of sexual exploitation, but these cases, because of a stigma, are much unseen and underreported. So even in our research, they came up here and there, but it's not something that we could truly dig into because of the stigma that surrounds these forms of exploitation. So to wrap up, what we found is that of the different pathways that I was describing before, the 6 main pathways that bring from climate change to vulnerability, the pathway that we call livelihood loss is the one that most directly creates this route into situations of exploitation, and it is then often exacerbated by other pathways and other forms of vulnerability taking place.
Thank you, Marta, for giving us a summary of how the pathways to exploitation kind of manifest and what the different forms of exploitation can look like for a few of those different groups. I wanted to turn back to Bethany now, and we've kind of looked more in depth at Antigua and Barbuda at the moment. So I want to zoom back out and ask, is what we're seeing in Antigua and Barbuda unique to this island, or is it part of a larger pattern globally that you're seeing with some of your other research as well?
Yes, so the experiences that people in Antigua and Barbuda are having are definitely unique to them, and that can be said for any kind of experience of hazard and exploitation. But what we see globally is that this is seen around the world, and I see climate justice sort of fitting into as a broader subset of social justice, and that we know that climate change is one of the pressing matters and issues of our time. And there is increasingly a lot of research and activist work being undertaken and being led by, in a lot of cases, the anti-trafficking space, addressing these interconnections. And the research that Marta's been presenting is a really good example of that. Um, and what we're seeing is that climate change, I think Marta calls it the cycle of vulnerability. We often call it a stress multiplier, essentially building on those risks. And meaning the impact of climate change is heightened or exacerbated. And I always think of the example of Cambodian brick kiln workers. There was a lot of research done by colleagues at Royal Holloway in London in the UK. Looking at how drought conditions were affecting farmers, and that reduced rainfall as a result of climate change was leading to movements of migrant workers to urban environments where they were working in brick kilns, leading to larger volumes of pollution, which was exacerbating climate change. And this idea that not only are you experiencing the threat of climate change and then being exposed to those impacts which enhance those vulnerabilities you're facing, but that then a person can unintentionally become part of the cycle that is feeding those risks. And that's just one element. There's also the fact that we're seeing increasing fluctuations and unpredictability in the climate. So there's an El Nino predicted for 2026, and it's predicted to be one of the more severe ones, which has the potential to lead for leading to increased rainfall across the Americas, but then extreme heat and wildfires in the east. And so there's this complexity of unpredictability that can leave particularly outdoor workers we see in sectors like agriculture, construction, vulnerable to higher levels of heat. But then also thinking about those communities that are in some of those higher risk and more vulnerable areas. So that can really impact the way that people respond, their capacity, and then what they experience. And I think globally, as there needs to be more of a recognition of the different types of hazards that people face. So whether they be hurricanes in the Caribbean or droughts in East Africa, to places where workers are exposed to things like the impacts of wildfires, for example. We've seen that a lot in the US. And in the UK, we increasingly see flooding as being a risk to outdoor workers more generally. So the exposure can very much vary. And being able to support those communities through tailored and community-led responses, I think, is really important. And given the time that we currently sit in, we're seeing a lot of issues around funding structures, not only in the trafficking space, but also this delegitimization of risks around human rights and change action. I think it's really important that when we're thinking about the larger global scale of climate change hazards upon trafficking, we're thinking about it through that collective lens and working with other groups that are working to achieve similar aims as well in this space.
Thank you so much for that, for bringing us, back to that global picture of what's happening and the patterns and how different areas are affected. I think as someone who's lived in Southeast Asia for the last 13 years, the example of Cambodia is very, fresh in my mind, having been in the farmlands of Cambodia and seen the brick kilns and knowing how vulnerable those populations in the agricultural areas are, that it can take, I mean, just a month's worth of wages can be the difference between them keeping their farms or moving to, having to move to the city and work in a place that they're very much subject to exploitation and the force of other people's will in those places. So thank you very much for that. I want to follow up with another question. Based on your research and this global picture that you're looking at, what lessons can we learn? What efforts are underway to address the risk of exploitation, that's attached to climate change risks? And what gaps have you observed? So, like, where do you see hope, and where do you see opportunities for improvement as we move forward?
Yeah, I always like a little bit of hope because climate change can be a little bit doom and gloom. And as someone who works at the intersection of climate change and labor, it can feel a lot of doom and gloom a lot of the time. Um, I think what comes to mind most is the word co-production. So I think really working in to address climate change, working with, by, and for communities, being led by communities that are most impacted. There's so many Indigenous and community-led programs, historical community experiences around in Bangladesh, knowing how important the mangroves are. I remember being at the launch of the report and people talking about long-term ways of building houses within communities in Antigua and Barbuda, which was really exciting to hear about and learn about. And in terms of the worker-led response, I think workers have a real power in also addressing climate change impacts. And I immediately go to the Fair Food Programme by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And they've done a lot of work around not only addressing exploitation risks for predominantly outdoor workers, but then going back and reviewing and enhancing their policies. I'm thinking particularly the heat stress policy that was launched. So in making sure that people have increased breaks where there's extreme temperatures, making sure adequate shade is provided, and having that real tangible effort of the workers have identified this need as a result of the impacts of climate change and put in place something that is required by those signatories of the scheme. And I think the lessons to learn there are that it can be done, it is possible, and it can be done with a rapid response. And I think increasingly the impacts of climate change, as they become more extreme and more rapid, that's the kind of fast work that needs to be done in this space.
Thank you so much for sharing those opportunities and those reasons to hope, and the different things that are slowly starting to emerge across, the landscape of responses. I want to turn back to Antigua and Barbuda and Marver. Are there relevant responses that specifically address these issues in the country? What is being done that has been successful in Antigua and Barbuda, and what gaps are you seeing at the local level? Just to kind of have that same picture of hope and opportunities for things going forward at the local level there.
So it's quite a bit of things, and I'm happy Bethany would have also set that stage for some of the work that's happening on a global level, because Antigua prides itself on making sure that it's at the table for a lot of these global discussions through AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States. At several points in time, Antigua and Barbuda has even been the chair of OASIS on different climate negotiation talks and discussions. So, on a global level, we're seeing Antigua being a very active part in promoting the United Nations Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and they're seeing where Antigua and Barbuda is promoting the adaptation of the loss and damage finance, particularly when it comes to climate mitigation and adaptation as a small island developing states, because oftentimes what we see is that we're on the forefront, we have a lot of our plans and a lot of our ideas, but we don't have the funding, we don't have the adequate resources that is needed oftentimes to combat some of these adverse effects that we're seeing. And even further, we're seeing when it comes to climate finance that Antigua and Barbuda is no longer eligible for certain climate finances because we're told that we would have graduated from a particular list. So then we're also seeing our active participation in the International Labour Organization, because again, when we speak of that conversation of vulnerability and climate change, our labor force is at that forefront, and advancing just transition and decent work principles are often very important and something we advocate for on that level. We often see a large support for climate mitigation governance through the IOM, which is the International Organization for Migrants. And we also see conversations and discussions on international platforms for modern slavery frameworks, increasing recognition for climate vulnerabilities. But then also in a regional way, Antigua and Barbuda, through some of our regional partners like CARICOM, which is the Caribbean Community, and the OECS, which is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, we are seeing the Caribbean community support for climate resilience and labor mobility. We would have engaged talks in relooking at different labor codes across the Caribbean islands to even just review minimum wages. And early this year, Antigua and Barbuda would have increased its average minimum wage, because at one point in time, the average person was working for what we would call $9.50 EC dollars, which is roughly about $4 US. And we've now seen it increase to some $13 and change. And this heavily affects persons again within that private tourism capacity. So we're seeing changes that started on a Caribbean level that would have trickled down. And then when it comes to organizations like the OECS that I would have mentioned, they are champions for sectors such as the blue economy. We're seeing them push resilience, social protection initiatives. We're also seeing them be at the table for different international negotiations and trainings. There was a recent convention on BBNJ, which is biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, that we can see it affecting even the regular person, because it affects the country's GDP and its ability to gain revenues and foreign direct investment. So then we're also seeing other regional partners such as SEDIMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Environment Management Agency. They heavily support countries within the Caribbean who provide relief and assistance during these natural disasters. So we're seeing a lot come up: regional disaster coordination, strengthen emergency responses. So offices of natural disaster services along each Caribbean island, we're adopting certain common practices, certain building, right down to even our building codes to be able to withstand. And those are some of the current solutions that are small steps with big impact. But then when we take it even a bit deeper and we look at a local level, and what are some local solutions, not just regional responses and global, but what are some local solutions on the ground? And this is where I would definitely highlight the blue economy. And the government would have launched the Department of the Blue Economy in the middle of COVID, December 2020. And the main aim of a Department of the Blue Economy is to look at how can we inject into our GDP a more diverse basket of goods and bundle of goods with our ocean resources in a sustainable manner. So oftentimes in the Caribbean, we have accesses because we also are known as a large ocean states. So we have access to a lot of ocean resources, but it's tapping into it in a sustainable manner that is not exploitative, but also ensures that we are taking care of our environment and the space around us. So expanding some of those blue economy programs and initiatives. Blue economy touches on so many things: coastal communities, fisher folk, the shipping industry. Again, we're heavily tourism based, and it's not just tourism based on flights from different parts of the world, but also cruise ships. That is also a part of our tourism product. And it's also looking at local solutions that focuses on mangrove restoration and marine conservation. We would have started different initiatives even in our national parks area, a mixed use ecosystem area, because it's part land, part ocean use, and it's a tourist attraction. And they ensure that they have our cultural heritage at the foresight of that area. It ensures that environmental conservation, environmental protection is, at the forefront of a lot of the activities. There's an ecologist to ensure that environmental degradation is also not rampant, because again, it is that type of mixed use space. And mangroves are often seen as some of the greatest protections for Caribbean islands, especially since when it comes to protection from storm surges, for our fisheries resource, because it is a nursery for smaller fishes. And not just that, but we're also seeing that we can look at tourism through ecotourism lens. So often in the past, we would have removed many of these mangroves. We're now seeing how can we integrate our tourism practice in a sustainable manner to not just preserve mangrove, but ensure that we can generate some revenues and protect ourselves in a climate resilient or climate mitigative way. We're also seeing youth enter more green and blue skill development avenues. Recently, even here locally, through programs with UNICEF and the Department of Youth Affairs, they would have conducted a trainees workshop on blue, green, and circular economies to train a handful of young persons on local programs, teaching other young persons how to, whether you're going to the schools, going to local organizations, and just invite the general public out to learn more about the blue economy, the green economy, and how they all tie together for the circular economy. So remember those R's: reuse, reduce, recycle. Everything comes together as a way of mitigating our climate realities, and as well as providing opportunity for persons to gain an income. Oftentimes what we see with our vulnerable communities is their limited ability to generate incomes to protect themselves from some of these climate shocks. And those are some of the avenues. We're also seeing greater disaster preparedness and coastal resilience initiatives. Recently, the Barbuda is recognized as a Ramsar site because of its lagoons, and again, many of its coasts having that large bird sanctuary over there, and being home to such a large group of biodiversity because of it's again the mixed use land, the sea. We saw there was a team here as well ensuring that that site is protected, because we've noticed that when there are natural disasters such as hurricanes, and again with rising sea levels, our sister island Barbuda is going to be at the the forefront of that? How do we ensure that the persons who live on that sister island are going to be adequately taken care of and provided for? We would have had a stark reality again when Hurricane Irma hit. And then even before that, there was Hurricane Lewis, who mainly had effects on the mainland Antigua, but how do persons in Barbuda feel that effect? Because most of everything we import, we consume, it comes to the mainland and then goes over to the sister island. So ensuring that persons are disaster preparedness, they know where their emergency points are, they know where their evacuation points are. Those things have been heightened locally. And again, there's small steps with big impacts, because we had this saying when I was a little girl that earthquake never say when it's coming. So you never know when there's certain disasters that are coming. So it's best to be prepared than be caught off guard. And then last and most importantly, that I see is taking shape on a local level is some of the social transformation programs targeting vulnerable communities. There was a program started way back in 2023 where it enabled persons, again, differently abled individuals, to construct aquaponic sites, small backyard aquaponic initiatives. Again, you're helping with food security, because that is often of climate crisis, and it pushes persons into unfavorable working conditions and situations just to be able to feed their family and the persons around them. So being able to do that as a differently able person was very good. And then we also seen other social programs where homeless persons, or persons who are economically challenged, are also being provided, whether it's a short-term housing, whether it's at least a meal station open 24 hours for them. And some of those are the local solutions, as well as even looking at our legislation. So we're seeing key gaps that are some way and shape being provided for when it's climate adaptation policies, because they often overlook labor exploitation risk. We're also seeing areas where data is pretty important to make sure you have that proper tracking of climate related trafficking situations and labor force situations. So that has also been increased through the Royal Police Force of Antigua and Barbuda, and it has come a long way with helping to even provide solutions to persons who find themselves at the unfortunate end of a climate induced, I guess you can say, crime. So those are some of the ways I would highlight Antigua is playing a very key part, not just on a local, but a regional and international level, with ensuring that it's not just the gaps that we're seeing, but there's some solutions, and Antigua is trying its best, especially where advocacy is regarded to addressing some of these problems.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a much more detailed and richer response than I was expecting. And I think my reaction as I was listening to all of that was that there's probably a lot of communities around the world who would do good to look at what Antigua and Barbuda are doing in a lot of these areas, and to reach out and try and learn how to incorporate some of these ideas into their climate change policy and efforts as well. So given everything that we've discussed today, I know, Marta, that the research we've done, there's some recommendations that came along with the research that resulted from that research. So I guess I'd like to hear from each of you what needs to change to actually protect people at the intersection of climate change and human exploitation. I think we'll go kind of large scale to local scale, and we'll give Marverly the last word again. Uh, just to make sure that we kind of keep the same bar. We end with the focus on the islands where this report started. So I'll turn it back over to Bethany for kind of recommendations from a global level, and then Marta, we can hit the recommendations from the research, and then we can close with Marver's perspective on the recommendations and what she feels would be most helpful in the specific instance of Antigua and Barbuda. Bethany, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I think going from that global effort, as Marva mentioned, I think the way that we understand and address climate change really needs to center on being funded and supported by those who have historically and also continue to drive climate change. So that's higher income developed nations, but that the action really needs to be undertaken at the community level and driven by those that have the creative solutions. I'm thinking youth, I'm thinking the local communities that are most impacted. It cannot be just put on this Western lens of this is how you address climate change, and imposing it on communities. That's just simply not how it works. And I think the way that that needs to be done is I'm going to bring it back to that idea of collective action at that global scale. It needs to be communities that are addressing these multiple complex issues across the human rights and climate justice, social justice space. We're coming together and working together, because we can't really address climate change properly without survivor and community-led adaptation and mitigation knowledge and ideas and programming. But we also can't really address exploitation without tackling climate change. And I think that's something that the anti-trafficking space has been doing quite well, is bringing those two together. And now I think it's about how we translate that into making sure that some of those climate change efforts are actively including and talking about working conditions, community rights, and addressing some of those core intersectional social justice risks.
Thank you so much for that, Bethany. Marta, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Beth, for emphasizing the importance of intersectional approaches, and also for bringing a bit attention towards the work that in the anti-trafficking space has been done in recent years to encourage these kind of reflections and encourage policies that respond and address the intersection between the two. I think bringing it back to our Free the Slaves and CHRI research, we concluded our report with a series of recommendations that are addressing the government of Antigua and Barbuda, civil society in the country, but also the regional stakeholders at the Caribbean level. And I'm going to touch on a few of them. The full list can be read in our report. Here I'm just going to touch on a few of them, but speak more directly to some of the issues that we discussed today with Beth and Marver. So one of the first recommendations that we bring forward is to invest in climate resilient infrastructure, which can reduce vulnerability by supporting stable livelihoods and improving access to essential services. And this includes the creation and the management of secure temporary shelters to protect displaced populations during and after disaster, something that we talked about before, minimizing in this way the risk of exploitation for those displaced individuals who are forced out of their houses. Also, investment in climate resilient infrastructure is important within key economic sectors, and mentioning once again tourism, as this can help to limit the climate-related disruptions to tourist-related activities, and thus protect livelihoods for those who work in the tourist industry. Another recommendation, and back to the tourism sector once again, is to integrate climate risk reduction into the tourism sector. So incorporated climate risk reduction in tourism policy and planning can help ensure sustainable livelihoods for those people that are working in this critical sector for the country's economy and reduce vulnerabilities. In Antigua and Barbuda, also protecting critical natural assets such as beaches and coral reefs, such as Marver was telling us before, upgrading tourism-related infrastructure, diversifying tourism offering are some of the steps that can help maintain the country's attractiveness as a tourist destination, but also supporting economic stability and reducing reliance on informal or high-risk employment. Looking at another sector of the economy that we said before is quite exposed to climate change and its impact, agriculture. So promoting climate resilient agricultural practices, which can strengthen livelihoods in the farming sector, while contributing also to food security, which is one of the other areas that we see can be negatively affected by climate change. And priority actions would include building on current government efforts, including diversifying crops and livestock, improving water management through efficient irrigation and harvesting methods, developing climate-resilient crop varieties, and using technology to support farm planning and productivity. Another recommendation that we consider quite important is to support livelihood diversification. So this is something that builds economic resilience, reduces vulnerability to exploitation in climate-affected contexts. So by expanding alternative and stable income-generating options, individuals would be less likely to accept exploitative work. And examples of livelihood diversification include combining agricultural or on-farm activities with non-farm employment, so basically getting a wage job or starting a small business. As I said, we also look at the wider Caribbean setting. We start from Antigua and Barbuda, but we also think that there is a lot to be said based on this research that is of interest and relevance to the wider Caribbean region. So we also develop a couple of recommendations that are targeted at CARICOM. One of these is to introduce exploitation considerations into climate and development policies. So CARICOM should encourage its member states to adopt a whole government approach that addresses structural drivers of exploitation across policy areas, and this includes applying a human exploitation lens to climate change strategies and sustainable development programs, rather than treating these issues in isolation, as Beth already mentioned before. And also, we encourage strengthening regional collaboration, something that, to be honest, has already been very much ongoing in the Caribbean. And we think, and the interviewees with whom we spoke for this research emphasize this point, regional collaboration is crucial. So CARICOM and related regional institutions should further enhance coordination among member states to ensure more coherent and integrated responses to climate-related vulnerability and human exploitation. And I think I will stop here. And as I said, the full list of recommendations for those who are interested in exploring these issues further are available on our report.
Thank you, Marta. And now we'll turn to Marver for her recommendations.
And thank you for that. And I think Bethany and Marta would have laid a very beautiful scene and explained it so well, because many of these recommendations we see that there are vital overlaps when it comes to regional and global approaches and how they can be mitigated and can be addressed through holistic lens, whether it's through going there through blocks together, as I would have mentioned, through AOSIS. There are other alliances. There's ECLAC, because that also includes the Latin America, because we do have some states who are recognized as Caribbean, but not so much so SIDS, but are also in the forefront of the climate resilient fight and the human trafficking efforts that we see that are impacting all of us as a collective. But when it comes to the recommendations, especially coming out of this report, we're realizing that as Marta would have clearly articulated and highlighted, that climate adaptation plans should explicitly assess exploitation risk. We have national adaptation plans, strategic adaptation plans when it comes to environmental mitigation and climate disaster preparedness and readiness. Those things must include labor rights, safeguards, and how do we cater for the vulnerable in our society in these events. We also have a point that was beautifully highlighted by Bethany, that we must strengthen a lot of our systems when it comes to emergency income support, improved unemployment protections, and we must ensure that there is a rapid post-disaster assistance reaching vulnerable groups, because after disaster happens, that is when a lot of exploitation takes foothold, because it is a conducive environment now. It's an environment that is so right these things to unfortunately take root. And then when we speak of the work in place, we must look at climate smart sectors and promoting decent work in them, whether it's again our blue green circular economies, ensuring that jobs are not just adequately provided, but we're not repeating some of the mistakes of our past of not ensuring there's safeguards, fair pay, inclusivity, meeting labor standards, and the likes. And then when we even go further down, and this is what I loved about the report, that it also would have mentioned slightly better data collection is needed, and I see that as a overlapping, not just when it comes to climate displacement, but labor exploitation, trafficking patterns. There are some data out there, but how do we go about even gathering, protecting, and presenting this data in a holistic manner across all sectors and not just in subsets or pockets? And then there's definitely the protection of migrants and informal workers, when it's legal, labor reporting mechanisms, even reporting mechanisms we saw was an issue, and an overlapping. And then definitely invest in community resilience. This local communities, Marta would have touched perfectly on the agriculture sector. Oftentimes we do see females and young persons interested in the agriculture sector. So how do we ensure that local livelihoods are protected and these communities are strengthened to even provide adaptation solutions? Because oftentimes in small island states, all of the solution and the resources are expected to come from the government, but we have to approach it holistically and as a collective. So it's empowering those vulnerable populations directly as well. But what does this mean for Antigua? In Antigua and Barbuda, again, we're just on the 100,000. How do we utilize this resource, as in this report, the recommendations and solutions to even take it further and further? And climate resilience must definitely go beyond infrastructure. This report shows us that climate resilience has to also come from a people's lens. Protecting the reefs and the coastlines are essential, but we must also protect our people, and it's equally important. Those are our largest resource. We often, when we speak of resource, we think of the finances, but human resource is very integral and important. And then again, offer different pathways, whether it's economic diversification, in decent employment through different sectors, and reduce vulnerabilities, as well as practical local priorities. Make sure they're on the forefront of our discussions. At the time of the recording of this podcast, we're in April, and our general elections are set to be had at the end of this April, so April 30th. How do we ensure that those priorities are reaching the right person so they also are empowered right up to the very level through our parliament, through our government, to ensure that this takes root, and the programs that we need, the initiatives that we're talking about, the conditions that we're asking for are being met and also being provided for. So climate shocks don't create vulnerabilities, they just unfortunately expose them and deepen them, especially for small island developing states like ours, where coastal resilience and human resilience must be built out together and not in individual pockets. And if climate adaptation does not protect its most vulnerable, we must do some introspection and see, is it really adaptation, or is it maybe just partial adaptation? And my closing remark will be in the context of Antigua and Barbuda and across small states, climate action must be people-centered action. Our response must protect not only our coastlines, our coral reefs, but also our workers, our migrants, our young people, our women and girls, and our most vulnerable communities. That is what true resilience really looks like, and having that report shows us that it is possible and there are pathways out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marver, for closing that section so well. Collectively, it is an excellent set of recommendations that acknowledge the work already being done and highlights, as Marver just said, the pathways to enhancing these efforts. So I want to thank each of you, Marta for the detailed summary of the research, Bethany for the global perspective on the issue, and especially Marver for grounding our conversation with the knowledge and wisdom on the reality in Antigua and Barbuda, and the considerable efforts being made at many levels in the country to address both climate change and human exploitation. So I'll open it up for any final thoughts from anyone before we officially close the episode. Anything anyone would like to add at this point that we haven't covered?
I think we covered quite a lot of information throughout this podcast, and it was a pleasure to be here with Beth and Marver. I just kind of wanted to circle back to the very beginning when we were talking about small island developing states to emphasize the importance of doing more research and focusing more on this category of states, because they're very much underrepresented when we talk about research and the intersection of climate change and human trafficking. And yet, as we said at the beginning, they are at the front line of climate change and its impact.
Thank you, Marta. Bethany, any final words?
I think it's just been really insightful hearing from Marva, and congratulations to Free the Slaves and Marta for the really excellent report. And it really does push forward the boundaries, particularly looking at some of these small island developing states, as you say.
Marver, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just like to add that these conversations will always be essential, always be integral, because it shows that as a people we are thinking just beyond the surface level. We are looking beyond just the headlights and what is at the surface of the discussion. And when we go to international forums and when we go to advocate, it's these discussions, it's these research that are going to be very integral, especially for small island states like ours, who don't necessarily have all of the resources, or maybe not even thinking of a particular area that could directly affect us. And it has shown in the past that it has affected us. So these discussions are very timely, they're very much encouraged. And thank you so much again for providing the platform, for doing the work, Martha, for doing your awesome work, and Bethany, work that you do and research that you carry out are very integral to small island developing states and some of the work we do. And I think that's where I would leave it. I would have said a lot with regards to the cross section of vulnerability and climate resilience. And I look forward to more conversations and discourse. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Thank you. And with that, we will close the episode. So just for our audience to kind of close up here, climate change is often framed as an environmental or economic crisis. Today's conversation reminds us that it is also a human crisis. That this, as Marver said, this is a problem that needs people-centered solutions, not just infrastructure, not just economy. So if you want to learn more, the full report From Climate Crisis to Human Exploitation is available through Free the Slaves website. It is linked in the description of this episode, and it is also available on the website of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. So thank you so much for listening, and please subscribe to the podcast for future episodes.